Alright guys, this video I will dedicate about the possible peace talks between Ukraine and Russia and whether the peace is really possible at the current stage. Long story short, it's not. Hello my friends and welcome, my name is Dennis and this is the latest update from Ukraine. Let's go. Reuters published the information that Zelensky says that the battlefield situation creates opportunity to bring the end to a war in 2025. The question is what battlefield situation, because we don't see the positive signs for Ukraine on the battlefield. Yes, it was like 2 months ago in Kursk direction, but now that direction is a standstill and Russia attacks with enormous forces on the east. And judging on my personal talks with people in the Ukrainian army, they're not very positive about that battlefield situation really. There are significant risks for Ukraine. So in this case, bringing the end of the war, what does it mean really? What Zelensky meant with that phrase? Well, it's hard to say, but at the same moment, it is understandable that the Ukrainian government is being pushed by many of the allies to start direct talks with Russia. But we know that Zelensky was opposing those talks and he even introduced the ban on speaking with Vladimir Putin himself. And also there is a big question whether Russia is okay with those talks because Lavrov, the foreign minister of the Russian Federation, said that they demand from Ukraine the capitulation of at least 4 of the regions: Kherson, Zaporizhia, Donetsk and Luhansk. Russia confirmed those demands again 1 day ago. The Russian regime and Putin are sure that they might be successful on the front lines using military power. That's why they're pushing Ukraine more. They say that Ukraine becomes more and more isolated from the Western allies. If we are also speaking about the limited military support of Ukrainian army, it is not what it was the last year. There were also issues with the military support from the United States. The MAGA blocked the military bill and Ukraine wasn't able to prepare for this summer campaign. There are also some of the internal issues in Ukrainian government, in Ukrainian army, so Russia is pushing, they're using the situation and pushing really hard with all of the resources they have, but it doesn't mean that Russia will be successful like that on the front lines for a very long time, because they also struggle with resources. But Putin obtains kind of the limited information. I think he really thinks that he might demand Zaporizhia from Ukraine, for example. My friends, just a short break. If you want to support the job that I do daily on YouTube, you might join my Patreon. The link for my page I'll put in the video description just below. Thank you so much. But you know, after all, Russia doesn't need those regions of Ukraine. Mostly they're devastated. They require tons of funds of investment to be rebuilt. And Russia will not do it. They basically will create the bridgeheads for the further strike of Ukraine. The main goal for Russia is to occupy Ukraine with the capital city of Kiev. Well, probably they don't really want the western part. In their rhetorics, we may say it. Why am I so sure about it? Well, because Putin speaks about it himself. He spoke about it even before the full-scale war was started against Ukraine. He's just concerned with this idea of the restoration of the Soviet Union, including Ukraine. So Ukraine should never ever be a separate republic. It should be a part of Russia. According to the logic of Putin, Kiev is a Russian city as well as the entire Ukrainian territory. Well, this area is under the question according to Putin's logic because it belonged to the other states, like for example the Austro-Hungary Empire or Poland. Remember the interview of Putin to Tucker Carlson. We may say that Putin is crazy. Indeed he is. He has his own mindset stating that there are no Ukrainians. Ukrainians are brainwashed Russians, that's what he says. And it was the Western idea to ruin the unity of Russians. But at the same time, Russia has this fascism ideology. Throughout the history and even now they cancel all of the Ukrainian, and if you want to leave you need to be Russian. So you need to say that you are not Ukrainian, you are Russian, and that's how you live in this Russian empire. And if Russians somehow occupy Ukraine, they'll establish repressions against pro-Ukrainian people, and now in Ukraine most of the people are pro-Ukrainian. And we also saw how Putin managed to get to Kiev. He thought that the limited forces would be just enough to take this big city under control, and he didn't expect such a resistance from ordinary Ukrainian people. In Kiev there were the cases that government just gave Kalashnikov rifles to locals to defend the area, and there were many volunteers at the very beginning of the war. And after Blitzkrieg didn't happen, Putin changed its strategy to exhausting war, and the sad reality that it seems like this strategy really works in favor of Russia in a long-term perspective. Putin is using its slave forces in Hungary, lobby in the United States, lots of the bribes, to disturb the unity of the allies, and we see that in many of the European countries the far rights take the majority, and usually those parties are affiliated with the Russian sources. Well, Italy is the exclusion now, far right took the power, but they're anti-Russian. So it's a very complicated, difficult strategy from Kremlin. They've created the war in Syria, so there are many of the refugees which are going to the European Union, and there is the facts of the refugee delivery just from the Belarus border into Poland. And obviously it creates the internal crisis in Europe, and that is how Russia propels its own interests, because far rights are getting more popular throughout this crisis. And that's how they want to collapse the unity of our allies. Just remember the bipartisan support of the Ukrainian aid. The first time that Zelensky went to the United States, everyone was applauding, but now there is a big change. There is a big lobby of the politicians in the United States, involving even the richest people in the world, that think that Ukraine also should fall into the Russian influence. And they say that this war should be over on any kind of the terms, including giving up the part of the Ukrainian territory to the Russian Federation and also excluding the Ukrainian membership in NATO. At the same time, Putin is telling that he is ready for peace with Ukraine, but give us those oblasts that we put in our constitution. Ukraine will never do that step. If Zelensky signs those kind of the agreements or any sort of the government representative, he'll be crushed by the soldiers. And by the way, we have one more report from some sort of the media, big media, I don't remember right now which one, and they say that if Zelensky signs agreements with Russia, there is a risk for the revolution in Ukraine, because the military community doesn't support that step. That's what they say. But I would say that majority would support if this part of Ukraine will enter NATO right away. So if we have robust guarantees from the NATO alliance, yes, the agreements should be signed, because Ukraine obtains just a limited support, and with NATO the long-term peace is really possible. Without NATO the long-term peace is impossible, and Russia will start one more war as it started then it occupied those territories of the self-proclaimed Luhansk and Donetsk republics. The new front line will be much longer, and as you see, the border here is also very long, so it's impossible really to protect it. And after a couple of years, then our allies will be sleeping during the night time. Russia will attack Ukraine with its major force, much bigger force than it used in February of 2022, and by doing so, they'll occupy Ukraine. Ukraine will be caught off guard as well as our allies, so there will be no one to defend Ukraine, but only NATO membership can save that. You may say, Dennis, you don't have the evidence. I don't need the evidence. You may switch on every Russian TV channel. You may switch on every Putin's interview. They do not see Ukraine as an independent state. They'll try to get rid of it. And if they vested 500,000 of their soldiers, or maybe even more, for this war, they'll not stop. They don't care about their losses. They don't care about the consequences. The only bad consequence for Russia are the nuclear warheads, which are only possible if Ukraine gets the protection from NATO alliance. Any other security guarantees will not work. As we know now, the Ukrainian government insists on the NATO membership, but our allies are not solid about it. Our Hungarian partners say that they will not accept the Ukrainian membership in NATO because they think that it might lead to the Third World War. But if Ukraine is not accepted in NATO, it will lead to the full Ukrainian occupation, and Russia will not stop then. They will push even more, and by the time they will use Ukrainian army. It may sound unrealistic, but exactly the same story happened to Chechnya, so Ichkeria, which was by the time the independent state, because there were Hasavurt agreements signed between Chechnya and Russia. According to those agreements, Chechnya is recognized as the independent state by the Russian Federation. But then Putin got the power, he started the Second Chechen War. It was hard for the Russian forces in Chechnya, that's why they tried to find some of the internal force to break the country from inside, and they found it. We are speaking about Kadyrov's clan or Kadyrov's family, which still keeps the power until this day. Russia has established the absolute dictatorship in the country. They provide repressions, and mainly ordinary people do live in poverty. And now Russia forced Chechens to fight in Ukraine. We don't need to come out with our own ideas. We just need to see the picture which Russian side provides to us and know some of the history lessons. The Chechen War was a big conflict between the nations. Russia provided the anti-Chechen propaganda on their TV, but after they were victorious, they are okay with Chechens. Then they started the war against Georgia, they did the same steps with their propaganda, and now it's turned for Ukraine. You may say, Dennis, Ukraine just hates the Russian Federation. Well, I may reassure you that most of the Chechens also did hate the Russian Federation, but they were not able to defend themselves against the prevailing enemy. And now Ukraine should do it to defend itself. Because later on, with the repressions, with propaganda and ideology, Russia may convince some part of the Ukrainian population to fight on their side to restore the Soviet Union. Now I'm not speaking about only the Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania and Estonia plus Poland. The threat for those countries is visible. But also there will be the conflict, the possible conflict in Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan and other ex-Soviet republics, including, by the way, Armenia. A couple of days ago, there was the interview with the Polish military officials, and they say that there will be a possible war between Poland and Russia, and they say that our generation will see it. So they also think about this possible Chechen scenario in Ukraine. So we see how our allies are pushing Ukraine for some sort of the peace talks with Russia, but they do not understand the consequences of those without real security guarantees, and they should ask Putin first whether he is really oriented on a truce peaceful agreements with Ukraine. For Ukraine, it is now understandable that the occupation of the territories is simply not possible because the lack of the resources that Russia is taking the ground, but Russia at the same time is also struggling. My idea that if we let Russia to reform its army, to get more soldiers, to get more army equipment, in a couple of years they will attack Ukraine again. It will be the second Minsk agreements, there will be no any difference, just the front line will be longer and the possible war will be even harder. Russia will never ever get out from Ukraine. It will continue to push Ukraine using all of the means, diplomatic and military. They will also try to feel the right moods in Ukraine, creating the internal conflict, and I already see the signs of it. Well, you know that I don't really like our current president and I don't really like our government, but any riots, any revolutions against the government should be absolutely avoided because Russia will use it and they will conquer. They may conquer Ukraine in that case. It's a huge risk. So any sort of the changes in Ukraine should be done only in a democratic way. Whether allies may force Putin to change his plan on Ukraine, well, I only think that with a long-range weaponry permission, with hundreds of the airplanes flying in Ukrainian Air Force, with massive equipment delivered to Ukraine, only that may help in this case. Russia understands only power. If Putin thinks that he may conquer Ukraine in military way or in some other way, he will continue to do it, and for now we see that he is convinced that he is able to achieve his goal, and he doesn't care about resources he used in this war. He also doesn't care about politicians like Donald Trump. If Donald Trump says that he has a good relationship with Putin, Putin simply don't give about it. He only wants to achieve his goal to make the Soviet Union great again. But with his actions, Putin is also risking a lot, and instead of creating a new big country with a large world influence, he ruins Russia. Again, we may speak a lot about the sanctions, but after all, they work, and still democratic countries, they do have the value. Yes, Russia has the partners in China, India, the countries which buy oil and gas from Russia, but it's not enough to maintain the current Russian economy, so it will decline for sure. Yes, Putin will still have everything for his army, but the ordinary Russian people will suffer more and more, and that creates the possibility of the internal cracks within the Russian society. Before the war, Putin's regime was more stable, but with Prigozhin's move, for example, it is just an example, everything is possible nowadays in Russia. The Russian regime looks solid, but after all, it's not really like that. And you know, guys, the Kursk operation was an uppercut for the Russian regime. All of the possible red lines were crossed, but unfortunately, White House administration didn't support at the proper time the permission for Ukraine to use the long-range missiles. That would have influenced the Russian defense a lot, and Ukraine would have moved even more. Now we see that this operation is standstill, and I would say even more, our allies support Ukraine just with limited amount of the weaponry, barely enough for Ukraine to defend itself. I guess I told you about those stories and this logic in my videos before, but here I decided to tell you about it in a single video, why the peace talks are generally not possible with the current Russian regime. And judging on the current reality, we may understand that Ukraine may deoccupy its territories only after the collapse of the Russian regime. And before that collapse, Ukraine should halt. The best variant is to join NATO and stop the war really with Russia. So Russia will afraid to attack Ukraine because the fifth article will be implemented in that case. Yes, it's risky, but more risky is to let Ukraine to be occupied by Russia. It is risky not for just Europe, but for everyone in this world. And the second variant is to disturb the Russian military bases, their aviation, their supplies, everything. But for that, Ukraine needs absolutely astonishing amount of the long-range weaponry resources, aviation, as I told you, and judging on behavior of our allies, well, they're not giving the stuff to us in those quantities. Also, as we know, the political situation really influences Ukraine. And we see that the possible Trump's administration will not take Ukraine in NATO, and they will insist on Ukraine to just give its territory to Russia. That's it. They don't really care about the destiny of the country, which wants to be the part of the Western society, democracy. For Donald Trump, Ukraine is just a buffer area between Russia and NATO countries. He doesn't really care about the country's destiny. What about the Kamala administration? Well, there is the chance that Ukraine will be invited in NATO, but again, it's not a one-day question. It may take years for Ukraine to achieve this membership, especially as we know that Hungary, Slovakia, and probably Turkey will oppose the decision to take Ukraine in NATO. Well, we see what the Ramstein meeting will bring us in the coming days. By the way, I heard the news that it might be postponed because Biden cannot go on time to participate in that meeting. Hopefully the hurricane in Florida will not be that devastating as it is forecasted, and Biden will be able to move and take the part in a very important meeting. And about the Chinese-Brazilian plan, by the way, they also think that Ukraine should give its territories to Russia, at the same time not recognizing those as the Russian ones, and Ukraine should stay as a sovereign country. That's the big difference between Chinese and the Russian plan, because China really wants to have its influence on Ukraine as well, as it has, by the way, on Belarus. Yes, Belarus is the Russian puppet, but also it's the Chinese puppet as well. China invested lots of the resources into the Belarus economy, even more than Russia. For this reason, maybe Belarus is not taking part directly in the war against Ukraine, because China still rules there, they have their own influence, and they also speak with Russia about the Belarus involvement, and they're strongly against it. So Ukraine for China is the second Belarus, just with entry to the Black Sea. In 2013, the ex-Ukrainian president Yanukovych agreed with China that there will be ports built for the Chinese products which go to Europe in Crimea. But after it, Russia occupied Crimea and they cancelled this project. So Russia also depended on China, but they have different interests on Ukraine. They have, let's say, even some sort of the conflict on Ukraine. But after all, for China, if Russia occupies Ukraine fully, it's still better than Ukraine will develop as the independent pro-Western state, because the Western world, democratic world, is a big competitor, the biggest one for China. So if there will be this question, they will obviously support the Russian plan, but they'll try to implement their own, which will include some sort of the sovereignty of Ukraine, but Ukraine will turn into the second Belarus state with more Chinese influence than Belarus has. Let's say less Russian, more Chinese. So guys, it was just me talking about the possible future of the peace deal between Ukraine, my country, and the Russian Federation, our direct enemy. Guys, as for the updates of the front lines and some of the news, yes, we have those. Those are sometimes even awesome for Ukraine. Yes, Ukraine again kaboom some of the Russian military infrastructure. Well, for that, I'll film the separate video. I'll publish it probably tomorrow morning. If you like this video, just support pressing your huge like. By doing so, you help me a lot. And as usual, I wish you all a peaceful sky wherever you are, and have a great time.